Night clings to New Orleans like a silk shawl, damp with Gulf heat and perfumed with magnolia. Street lamps glaze the puddles on Chartres Street. Shutters breathe in and out along shotgun houses. Somewhere, a cornet warms up on a balcony as if the night itself needs a soundtrack. In these hours, the city is all rhythm. Lace curtains, distant laughter, the river's hush, and jazz rehearsals stitching one melody to the next. But there's another sound in the darkness, one that doesn't belong to the music. The whisper of a chisel teasing loose a thin wooden panel beside a kitchen door. A soft, patient scrape, the careful lift of a latch. Footsteps measured on old pine floors. A figure, moonlit and hunched at the edges, carrying a tool borrowed from the very homes he breaks. An axe taken from a backyard shed, a chopping block, a cellar. In the morning, the city wakes to headlines that don't match the soundtrack. Grocer slain in grisly night attack. Woman clings to life. Assailant vanishes like a ghost. And while the Mississippi rolls indifferent toward the Gulf, New Orleans begins to ask itself questions that stick like humidity to the skin. Who is the man who walks with an axe and a metronome's patience? Why grocery shops? Tiny family businesses tucked under porches and awnings. Why the missing door panel, always a panel, never a shattered glass? And why, after the blow, silence? Tonight, we descend into a story where music meets murder, where the notes of a cornet become a kind of prayer, and where the city's heartbeat, the downbeat of jazz, becomes both a shield and a dare. This is the Axeman of New Orleans, a specter who turned a city of melody into a city of insomnia. But before the first horn swells, before even the first scream, let me ask you, if you knew a song could save your life, would you keep playing? Or would you turn out the lamp and gamble the silence? The summer of 1918 arrives too soon, strewn with the ash of war and the slow, sick drift of an influenza that will soon claim the young and the old without prejudice. But in New Orleans, life improvises. People go to work. Laundry blooms like flags on lines. Bread ovens breathe at dawn. And in a small corner of the city, the Maggios, Joseph and Catherine, close their little grocery late and turn the sign to asleep. The house is like countless others. Wooden bones, thin skin, a kitchen door with a fragile rectangular panel. It's the sort of door a careful hand can study. The sort of door a careful hand could open. Suppose that hand belongs to a man who believes in patience, who has the time to remove a panel, slide a hand through, lift a latch, and step inside without breaking so much as a sliver of glass. Suppose that hand closes around the haft of a heavy tool, a tool so intimate to home and hearth that its presence feels like betrayal. What happens next will show in headlines and police files, in sketches and whispered accounts at butcher counters. But what happens in the moment between the slow slide of wood and the first blow belongs to the night alone. It's one of those unspoken, unlit spaces history never learned to capture. We can only imagine the breath, the creak, the quick calculus of danger. By dawn, the neighborhood blurs with uniforms and horror. The axe, they say later, was found in the yard. The crime almost impersonal. No theft worth noting. No jimmied window thrown to shards. No muddy boot print of rage. Just a method. Just a door with an empty panel and a home with empty air where voices should be. Gossip does what it always does. It tries to make sense of the senseless. A jealous rival? A debt? Some stranger who drifted off the riverboats? But there's a line in the police summary that chills even the city's talkers. The weapon belonged to the victims. He comes in with nothing. He leaves with nothing. He takes only the living breath of the place, and even that remains, caught in the mouths of neighbors and family who will tell and retell the story until it belongs to the city as much as the music does. It would be tempting to say it ended there, a madness, however cold, satisfied by a single night. But New Orleans knows the rhythm of repetition. Streets loop around. Music repeats, transforms. Grief returns to the same door with a different face. At the end of this chapter, the city is still telling itself it was a terrible accident of fate. A single storm cloud blown in from the Gulf. But storms repeat. And this one, this storm that entered through the door, will soon find other houses with the same kind of panel. And with each new morning, the question grows. What kind of man has patience for woodwork and murder in the same breath? What the investigators would soon find next would change everything. If you want to understand a city, count its grocers. Not the grand markets with brass scales and marble counters, but the corner shops with flour bins and coffee sacks, cash boxes, and pencils dulled by 1,000 small sums. These are the places where credit is extended on a nod, where a grocer knows who has a fever, who needs a cheaper cut of meat today, who found a little more sugar somehow. In 1918 New Orleans, many such stores belonged to immigrants who built their lives one ledger line at a time, Italians and Sicilians especially, speaking in a braid of tongues and carrying saints' names as if they were part of the day's inventory. They work long days, too long, and sleep in rooms just beyond their counters. It is a life as ordinary and sacred as bread. So when the city wakes to another attack, another panel lifted from a back door, another axe taken from a yard and returned to the scene like a terrible signature, something more than fear blooms. It's an insult to the ordinary, a crime against the quiet economy of trust. It's as if the city's small altars have been dishonored, and the candles gutter. Families begin to talk logistics in whispers. Who will sleep with a chair under the knob? Who will keep a shotgun by the bed? Mothers swollen with late summer heat feel the night shift inside them. Men sit on porches and ruminate about the kind of coward who comes in the night and does not break windows. They talk of adding iron bars, of hiring cousins to sleep in shifts. The police take statements. They make maps with pins and red thread stretched from grocer to grocer. They interview anybody who knew anybody. Boys who deliver ice, men who sharpen knives, drifters with loose stories about work on the docks. The pattern begins to look like a spider web. The same method, the same modest homes, the same stolen weapon returned to its place like a courtesy or a taunt. And yet, for every line that connects, there are lines that refuse to be drawn. No theft worth naming. No calling card but the surgical absence of wood and the blunt presence of an axe. The city's rumor mill begins to grind. Is this a vendetta? A mark against a community? Or is the target not the grocers at all, but the way they live, close to their shops, close to their doors, certain the night would respect their labor? On Sundays, the sanctuaries fill with prayers that smell like candle wax and tallow. Saints gather in the stained glass, their eyes lifted. The city goes about its business because what else can it do? But it does so with a slowed rhythm, checking locks, panels, latches. And everywhere, that same small rehearsed sentence passes between friends in English or Italian or a patchwork of both. Be careful. The papers give him a shape without a face. They do not yet call him by the name that will curdle blood a year later. For now, he is a whisper with a wood chisel, a rumor in the alleys, a shadow at the back door. The pattern calls to anyone who likes solving things, and there are many who do. Amateur sleuths, old men with newspaper clippings and pocketbooks, boys who ought to be in school. But each time they think they've found a rhythm, another attack lands just off the beat. And in the offices with green lamps and brass spittoons, investigators begin to wonder, is the city listening to a single musician or an ensemble of imitators? What the investigators would find next would change everything. There are stories a city can ignore. There are others it can outrun. And then there are the stories that walk into town carrying a letter addressed to every man, woman, and child who can read. Sometime in March of 1919, a letter arrives at a newspaper desk, signed with a name that isn't a name so much as a performance. The Axeman. It speaks with a theatrical swagger, boastful, oddly courteous, almost playful in a way that does not match the graves it implies. It says things like, on such and such a night, those who are playing jazz will be spared. Not because the city deserves mercy, but because the author claims a fondness for music. Can a city receive a letter and shrug? No. It does what people do when threatened by someone who both flatters and terrifies. It listens, plans, it imagines. The threat is as strange as its promise. Play jazz, the letter suggests, and you live. Remain in silence and you take your chances. Was it a prank? A taunt? A policy statement from a madman who understands that New Orleans would rather play than surrender? Or was it something darker? An invitation to fear itself, to become an instrument in the hands of someone waiting for the downbeat? The letter spreads across stoops and markets, barbershops, and second-line routes. And on the appointed night, the entire city, turns itself into a bandstand. Cornets and clarinets, pianos and drums, a hot five in every parlor. Even the shy become accomplices to melody. The air vibrates with 1,000 small insurrections against terror. Imagine the view from a rooftop, block after block where every open window carries notes. A river of sound flowing toward the river of water. Imagine families who have rarely seen joy outside of mass or weddings now standing in their kitchens, sleeves rolled, tapping time against fear. Imagine mothers who do not sing learning to hum for the first time because someone promised that a song can be armor. It's an absurdity. It's also a prayer. And for one night, the city's racket becomes a spell against violence. Fear doesn't vanish, it never does. But it finds it hard to breathe in a city so loud with defiance. People ask one another, days later, whether the letter was real or a hoax. Whether any of it mattered. They ask, half laughing, half trembling, if it was possible to buy life for the price of a melody. Some swear they saw a shadow in the alley that paused at the sound of a piano and moved on. Others claim the letter had to be a prankster's invention. The newspapers, having feasted on the panic, now dine on relief. Headlines become a kind of justification, the city that played for its life. Music as shield. But beneath the cuteness of it all, a colder question remains. Did the man behind the letter stand in some darkened corner that night and smile, knowing he had turned a whole city into his orchestra? And if he did the applause satisfy him or whet his appetite? When the jazz faded and the lamps were turned, the city knew that letters can end but habits do not. And habits, like prying off a door panel and carrying an axe, rarely retire with a single encore. What the investigators would find next would change everything. It becomes the investigator's ritual. Knock at dawn, step into the cool of a kitchen, taste dust in the air over coffee left half drunk. The mosquito coil smolders on a saucer. A loaf of bread wears the silk of a recently twisted paper sack. There is a door at the back with a thin rectangular hole where a panel used to be, the screws lined neatly in a row on the windowsill as if someone couldn't help the courtesy. The axe sits in the yard like a dog that knows it's done wrong and has come home anyway. Every detail repeats. Entry without shatter, the weapon gathered from the home itself, money and valuables untouched or almost. Blows delivered with a brutal intimacy that suggests both experience and a wish not to linger. Detectives sketch and measure. They whisper about the chisel. Always a chisel, always some careful woodwork. As if the tool were a calling card. The porch steps, the fence line, the alley. A choreography familiar now to anyone in the precinct who has walked it before. They wonder aloud, in those low whipstitch conversations cops have when they want to pretend they aren't afraid. Whether the killer is a carpenter, a dockman, a butcher who moonlights as a ghost. Neighbors gather in clusters to offer what they think is useful. A woman saw a man wearing a hat. A boy heard a footfall that didn't sound like his father's. A milkman left bottles earlier than usual and noticed a hinge out of place. The city provides details the way it provides music, in generous, sometimes contradictory measure. And always there's the question of motive. If it was money, why leave it? If it was rage, why the quiet? If it was vengeance, why the sameness of method and the randomness of victims? Investigators try on theories like Suits, a single killer with a ritual, 2 or 3 inspired by the first, a copycat who likes the scaffolding but not the performance. What they face is more than one man with an axe. They face the city's architecture itself, these wooden doors with their vulnerable panels, these yards with axes for winter kindling even in a city where winter is a rumor. They face the fact that New Orleans blurs public and private, porch and parlor, street and stoop. The very things that make the city generous also make it porous. There's a kind of thriller writer's neatness in a locked room puzzle. But this is the opposite. An unlocked city. The crime scenes refuse to close. Their doors refuse to stay. The river of people who pass by each day with deliveries and promises makes it hard to draw a circle around suspects. You can interrogate 1,000 men who sharpen knives and come no closer to understanding a ghost. So the detectives develop a new habit. They carry, in their pockets, a small list of instructions to tell grocers. Replace door panels with solid boards. Move the axes inside. Let the dog sleep in the kitchen. Don't presume a lock is a spell. Consider the night an accomplice to your weakness and conspire against it. For those who have already fallen, the city invents its own rites. Neighbors bring food. Priests make their rounds. Wakes fill with a music that is not jazz and yet is cousin to it. Hymns that reconcile the sacred with the stubborn human habit of survival. And somewhere, a man whose preferences include woodwork and midnight continues to walk with a chisel in his pocket and a patience that feels like a prayer turned inside out. He is not in a hurry. The city moves around him like water around a piling. But at the edges of the map, something else is taking shape, the outline of a final act that will leave more questions than answers. The city doesn't know it yet, but it can feel the tension, the way a bandleader hears a note that won't resolve. What the investigators found next would change everything. It becomes the investigator's ritual. Knock at dawn, step into the cool of a kitchen, taste dust in the air over coffee left half drunk. The mosquito coil smolders on a saucer. A loaf of bread wears the silk of a recently twisted paper sack. There is a door at the back with a thin rectangular hole where a panel used to be, the screws lined neatly in a row on the windowsill as if someone couldn't help the courtesy. The axe sits in the yard like a dog that knows it's done wrong and has come home anyway. Every detail repeats. Entry without shatter. The weapon gathered from the home itself. Money and valuables untouched or almost. Blows delivered with a brutal intimacy that suggests both experience and a wish not to linger. Detectives sketch and measure. They whisper about the chisel. Always a chisel, always some careful woodwork. As if the tool were a calling card. The porch steps, the fence line, the alley. A choreography familiar now to anyone in the precinct who has walked it before. They wonder aloud, in those low whipstitch conversations cops have when they want to pretend they aren't afraid. Whether the killer is a carpenter, a dockman, a butcher who moonlights as a ghost. Neighbors gather in clusters to offer what they think is useful. A woman saw a man wearing a hat. A boy heard a footfall that didn't sound like his father's. A milkman left bottles earlier than usual and noticed a hinge out of place. The city provides details the way it provides music, in generous, sometimes contradictory measure. And always there's the question of motive. If it was money, why leave it? If it was rage, why the quiet? If it was vengeance, why the sameness of method and the randomness of victims? Investigators try on theories like Suits, a single killer with a ritual, 2 or 3 inspired by the first, a copycat who likes the scaffolding but not the performance. What they face is more than one man with an axe. They face the city's architecture itself. These wooden doors with their vulnerable panels. These yards with axes for winter kindling even in a city where winter is a rumor. They face the fact that New Orleans blurs public and private, porch and parlor, street and stoop. The very things that make the city generous also make it porous. There's a kind of thriller writer's neatness in a locked room puzzle. But this is the opposite. An unlocked city. The crime scenes refuse to close. Their doors refuse to stay. The river of people who pass by each day with deliveries and promises makes it hard to draw a circle around suspects. You can interrogate 1,000 men who sharpen knives and come no closer to understanding a ghost. So the detectives develop a new habit. They carry, in their pockets, a small list of instructions to tell grocers. Replace door panels with solid boards. Move the axes inside. Let the dog sleep in the kitchen. Don't presume a lock is a spell. Consider the night an accomplice to your weakness and conspire against it. For those who have already fallen, the city invents its own rites. Neighbors bring food. Priests make their rounds. Wakes fill with a music that is not jazz and yet is cousin to it. Hymns that reconcile the sacred with the stubborn human habit of survival. And somewhere, a man whose preferences include woodwork and midnight continues to walk with a chisel in his pocket and a patience that feels like a prayer turned inside out. He is not in a hurry. The city moves around him like water around a piling. But at the edges of the map, something else is taking shape, the outline of a final act that will leave more questions than answers. The city doesn't know it yet, but it can feel the tension, the way a bandleader hears a note that won't resolve. What the investigators found next would change everything. In stories like this, the city wants names as much as it wants justice. Names are handles. They allow you to carry a story without dropping it. And New Orleans, crowded with stories, is a place that knows how to carry many at once. A brother who drinks too much. Was he jealous? A lover with nothing good to say about a man now buried. Was she vindictive? A rival shopkeeper who never earned as much as the dead. Was he vengeful? Investigators follow these threads, as they must, because beneath the ritual there is always the possibility of a human reason, however pitiful or grand. There are suspects who fit for a day and fall apart under the weight of more careful facts. There are men who seem like they might enjoy the quiet violence of fitting a chisel to a door. Men who have worked with their hands. Men whose tempers are whispered about in bars. There are even theories that the killer belongs to the very community being targeted. Revenge stitched into old country feuds moved to new country streets. The public's appetite for explanation is as bottomless as the city's humidity. Newspapers print speculation like recipes. Add a dash of jealousy, a sprinkle of organized crime, a pinch of mysticism. A few names rise to the top and stay there because stories need villains, and sometimes the villain is a caricature the public understands too easily. An immigrant, an outsider, a man who drinks alone, a man who smiles too seldom. None of that is proof. All of it is theater. The truth is more arrogant. The truth bends away from certainty. It hides behind the fact that ritual makes more than one man feel powerful. If the method is public knowledge, if every shopkeeper discusses door panels and axes, then anyone with a vicious heart could try the pattern on for size. Some nights, perhaps the city suffered a copycat. Someone who wanted to taste what fear tasted like. Other nights, the hand at the chisel might well have been the same one that wrote a letter signed with a brag. Police fall into an old trap, the desire for a singular villain. It makes headlines easier. It calms families who want to know whether to fear one ghost or a choir of them. But the city's voice grows more complicated as time goes on. Mothers whisper to one another that names won't save them. They are right. Names are for the living, and the man in the night wears none. As summer leans toward fall, a fatigue settles in. You can't stay frightened forever without the fear fraying into stubbornness. People begin to practice a kind of curated normalcy. They lock doors, yes. They move axes indoors, yes. But they also return to telling jokes on porches and arguing about baseball and gossiping about politics. It's not denial, it's survival. And yet, beneath this daily theater of resilience, the city remains alert. The way a musician keeps one ear on the drummer, listening for a change in tempo, because they know this isn't over. A ritual like this doesn't fade like a fad, persists. Then comes a night that feels like the end of a movement in a symphony, the music gathering itself for a final chord. A household wakes to catastrophe that looks like the others and yet feels different. A city that has learned the shape of horror will still find itself surprised. What investigators found next would change everything. The letter had once promised mercy to those who played. But letters are paper. Paper burns, tears, dissolves in rain. Fear remains, and fear makes its own weather. On a late year night, a house not far from where jazz spills out of open windows becomes the scene of another ritual. Door, panel, latch, floorboards speaking quietly under careful feet. At the edge of sleep, a woman thinks she hears the old house sigh. A man wakes and doesn't know why. Then the world tips from domestic to catastrophic in the span of a single breath. There are details the city refuses to repeat because repetition is a form of worship. Better to let the morning paper say brutal and leave it there. Better to let priests speak of mercy rather than rehearsal. But everyone knows the choreography by now, and everyone understands what it means when the axe is found outside leaning against a fence, as if waiting to be taken back up again when the night returns. Neighbors gather in the gray light, crossing themselves, or rubbing their forearms as if cold in a heat that never quite leaves. They talk about the letter again, the absurd mercy of music. Did anyone play late last night? Did someone forget to wind the gramophone? Did silence itself invite harm? This is superstition and mockery in equal measure. The killer, whoever he is, doesn't care for music except as a joke to himself. He cares for method. He cares for control. He cares for the small satisfactions of seeing a city contort itself to accommodate his ritual. Inside the precinct, the case grows heavier. Binders now, not folders. Photographs that would look like any family's kitchen if not for the stains. Detectives stop pretending to have a single suspect. They start speaking in plural possibilities. Theories tuned like instruments against the resonance of diminishing hope. And in the homes of those who have not been touched, the night becomes a negotiation. Lamps left on. Windows latched with the precision of a sailor tying knots. Dogs bribed with scraps to stay wakeful. Children, told the truth by half measures, learn to sleep in rooms closer to their parents. But terror has a law of diminishing returns. You can't live in a crescendo forever. Eventually, even fear has to catch its breath. The city doesn't relent so much as it adapts. The music doesn't stop. It changes key. People learn to look for light in one another's faces. Neighbors walk one another home. The corner shops become confessionals where people buy flour and exchange strategies for staying alive. Then, one dawn, news runs ahead of the milkman. Another scene, another home gutted by ritual. The city feels the shift in its gut. This is the arc bending toward an ending, though endings in true stories rarely look like justice. They look like absence. What investigators found next would change everything. One of the cruelest tricks of a city's worst nightmares is this. They sometimes end not with the click of handcuffs but with a fade-out. The Axeman story, if we must call him that, slides into history not with triumph but with a question mark. After the final attacks that season, the ritual stops. Not because the city solved it. Not because a particular suspect confessed in a clean moral arc. It stops the way storms move on. They exhaust themselves, or they choose a new shore, or they simply dissolve into weather. What remains behind is not closure but a void where closure ought to be. Into that void, New Orleans pours what it has always poured when faced with uncertainty. Stories. There are accounts of vengeance fulfilled in far-off places. Whispers that a widow tracked down a man believed to be responsible and enacted her own justice. There are stories that the killer died in another city, struck down by someone who recognized the ritual. There are stories that he simply grew old, hands still capable of removing a door panel without a sound, but turned toward other labors. None of it is proof. All of it is human. A city that loves narrative will choose narrative over blankness every time. But there's a strength in acknowledging the blank, too. The humility of saying, we were visited by something we never understood, and we endured it together. In the years that follow, the case turns into a kind of mirror. Writers use it to reflect on fear and community. Musicians use it to remind themselves that art is a weapon, or at least a shield. Police academies mention it because it shows how method can become myth. Families pass it along like a cautionary bedtime tale. Lock your doors, mind your tools. Love loudly because silence is no guarantee. The houses where pain once staged its ritual do what houses do best. They go on. New paint, new tenants, new babies in rooms where night once walked. An axe becomes just a tool again, heavy and honest in the hand. Door panels get replaced with solid boards. A city learns modest lessons about hinges and latches that turn into habits so natural no one remembers why. If this were fiction, there would be a satisfying final chord. In true stories, the band lays out and the air remembers. What the investigators and the city finally understood would change everything. New Orleans can be many things at once. Holy and profane, loud and secretive, decadent and disciplined. What the Axeman years taught, it was not to choose between those identities, but to braid them together into something resilient. The first lesson was painfully practical. Security is architecture. A panel small enough to be removed by a patient man is an invitation no one should extend. An axe left handy is no neutral object. The city learned to be less trusting of night, without letting mistrust turn into a kind of civic sorrow. The second lesson was cultural. Fear hates music. On the night the letter demanded jazz, New Orleans responded with a chorus so wide it reached the river and echoed off it. Whether or not a killer listened and turned away, the city heard itself that night and realized it could be louder than dread. That's not nothing. That's a kind of victory. The third lesson was moral. Stories can save or distort. It's human to want a single villain with a single face. It's human to give that face a name and put it on a poster. But life is crueler and stranger. Evil can be a ritual someone else imitates. Method can be a disease. The city learned to live with ambiguity, to honor the dead without pretending that understanding would bring them back. And the last lesson was the simplest. Community is a survival skill. Neighbors walked each other home. Priests and rabbis and elders made the rounds. Shopkeepers taught one another how to replace panels. Bands gathered. Family recipes were shared and doorframes hardened. It sounds small only if you have never needed a neighbor's porch light to walk you the last half block to your own door. So, was there ever a man who wrote that letter and stepped through those panels? Almost certainly. Was he the only one who used the method? Maybe not. Did he intend for the city to become his orchestra? Probably. But the city refused to audition. It performed for itself. As the years pass, the story becomes a part of the New Orleans canon, the way certain songs are always in the set. People bring it out when they need to explain why the city loves what it loves and fears what it fears. They tell it to remind themselves that the worst thing in the world can ask you to be silent, but you can answer with a horn. And you, listening now, letting this story ride the line between your ear and your bones, might be asking, what would I have done on that night? Would I have opened the piano? Would I have set the needle on the record? Would I have hummed into the dark just to prove I still belong to the living? If you're still here, subscribe, because stories like this deserve more eyes and more voices. What the investigators found next would change everything. Outro. A city that chose noise over night. By the end, the Axeman was less a man than a set of instructions anyone cruel could follow. But the city had an instruction to play. Keep the lights on. Bring the neighbors in. Share bread. Harden the doors. Name your fear and then drown it out. New Orleans refused to be defined by the worst thing that visited it. It chose to be defined by the opposite, by trumpets in kitchens, by laundries strung across alleys, by the exact way a hand touches a door latch when someone beloved comes home late. That too is a ritual. That too is a method. And somewhere, even now, the river remembers how the city sounded on the night it played for its life. Water holds vibrations longer than air. If you stand on the levee and listen hard, you might hear an old chorus returning to you. Defiance set to a backbeat. What do you think happened? Leave your theory in the comments. Someone out there knows the truth.